Sarah Chen stood before the mirror in her $12,000 wedding dress, reading a text message that would change everything. In 3 hours, she'd either be saying, "I do," to Silicon Valley's rising tech star, or running away with his wealthy business partner. Little did she know, both choices were about to unleash a chain of events that would shake the tech world to its core. Sarah Chen stood before the full-length mirror in her bridal suite, studying her reflection with a mixture of anxiety and determination. The $12,000 designer wedding dress hugged her curves perfectly, but her mind was elsewhere. In her hand, she clutched her phone, rereading the message that would change everything. "Meet me at the garden gazebo, now. Marcus." Marcus Reynolds was her fiancé David's business partner, and the man who had been secretly occupying her thoughts for the past 3 months. While David was the steady, methodical founder of their successful tech startup, Marcus possessed everything that made Sarah's heart race: charm, spontaneity, and most importantly, a recent investment deal that had made him worth 9 figures. She glanced at the clock. 30 minutes until the ceremony. With trembling fingers, she typed a quick message to her maid of honor. "Need some air? Back in 5. The lie felt bitter on her tongue, but she pushed the guilt aside. This was her chance at true happiness, or at least, that's what she told herself. The garden gazebo stood at the far end of the Crystal Lake Resort's immaculate grounds, hidden from the main building by a grove of weeping willows. As Sarah carefully picked her way across the lawn in her white heels, her dress gathering dew from the freshly cut grass, she spotted Marcus's tall figure waiting for her. He looked devastating in his groomsman's tuxedo, his dark hair slightly tousled by the spring breeze. "You came," he said simply, his green eyes intense as they took in her appearance. "You look beautiful, Sarah." "Marcus, what's this about? I'm supposed to be walking down the aisle in 20 minutes. Her voice wavered slightly, betraying her nerves. He stepped closer, close enough that she could smell his expensive cologne. "Don't marry him, Sarah. Come with me instead. I just closed another round of funding, $300 million. We could travel the world, live anywhere you want. David's a good guy, but he's—" He paused, choosing his words carefully. "He's never going to be able to give you the life you deserve." Sarah's heart pounded in her chest. Over the past year, she had watched David pour everything into their company, working 16-hour days, missing dates, always promising that the big break was just around the corner. Meanwhile, Marcus had been there, sending her thoughtful messages, remembering her favorite coffee order, making her laugh during the company happy hours. "What about the company? What about David?" she asked, though her resolve was already crumbling. Marcus smiled, reaching for her hand. "The company will be fine. David's the tech genius, but let's be honest, my connections brought in the major investors. As for David," he shrugged elegantly, "he'll understand eventually. Business is business." Sarah looked back toward the resort, where 200 guests were gathering to witness what was supposed to be the happiest day of her life. David would be getting ready now, probably fiddling with his bow tie in that endearing way of his, completely unaware that his world was about to shatter. "There's a car waiting by the service entrance," Marcus continued softly. "My private jet is fueled and ready at the regional airport. We could be in Santorini by tomorrow morning. I already have a villa reserved, just in case." The methodical planning impressed her. It was so typically Marcus, always thinking 3 steps ahead. She thought about the life he was offering: private jets, exotic locations, no more worrying about budgets or David's endless conversations about market penetration and user acquisition costs. "What about my things, the honeymoon reservations, the guests?" she asked, but they both knew these were just final token protests. "I'll have my assistant handle everything. The resort has your luggage. As for the rest," he pulled out an envelope from his jacket. "I've prepared a letter for David explaining everything. He deserves that much at least." Sarah's fingers closed around the envelope. Through the trees, she could hear the string quartet beginning to warm up. Time was running out. "You're sure about this?" she whispered, searching his face for any sign of doubt. Marcus reached up to brush a strand of hair from her face, his touch lingering on her cheek. "I've never been more sure of anything. The question is, are you ready to choose happiness?" In that moment, Sarah thought about her first date with David 6 years ago, when they were both fresh out of college with nothing but dreams and student debt. She remembered how he'd insisted on paying for dinner, despite having to eat ramen for the rest of the week. She thought about the night he'd proposed, not with an expensive ring, but with his grandmother's modest diamond, promising to replace it once the company took off. But then she looked at Marcus, with his perfectly tailored tuxedo and confident smile, offering her everything she'd ever dreamed of. She thought about the whispered conversations they'd shared in the office kitchen, the lingering glances during meetings, the electric tension that had been building between them for months. "Okay," she breathed, surprising herself with how steady her voice sounded. "Let's do it." Marcus's smile widened as he took her hand, leading her away from the gazebo. As they hurried toward the service entrance, Sarah felt a curious mixture of excitement and dread churning in her stomach. The weight of the decision seemed to press down on her with each step, but Marcus's warm hand in hers kept her moving forward. The black Tesla was waiting exactly where he'd said it would be, with tinted windows and a discreet chauffeur who opened the door without meeting their eyes. As Sarah slid into the leather interior, still wearing her wedding dress, she caught a glimpse of her reflection in the window. She barely recognized herself. "Don't worry," Marcus said, settling in beside her. "I've thought of everything. By this time tomorrow, you'll be sipping champagne on a private beach, and all of this will feel like a distant dream." As the car pulled away from the resort, Sarah tried not to think about David standing at the altar, waiting for a bride who would never arrive. She focused instead on the future Marcus was painting, a life of luxury, adventure, and passion. She had made her choice. There was no turning back now. What Sarah didn't notice was the slight smile playing at the corners of Marcus's mouth as he typed out a quick message on his phone. Nor did she see the brief flash of satisfaction in his eyes as he received a single word in response. Perfect. The Tesla wound its way through the countryside toward the regional airport, each mile taking Sarah further from her old life and deeper into whatever future Marcus had planned. She kept waiting for regret to overwhelm her, but instead found herself feeling oddly detached, as if watching someone else's life unfold. "You're very quiet," Marcus observed after they had been driving for about 20 minutes. "Having second thoughts?" Sarah shook her head, though her stomach was tied in knots. "No, just processing everything. It's a lot to take in." "Of course it is," he said smoothly, reaching over to squeeze her hand. "But trust me, this is for the best. David was holding you back, whether he meant to or not. You deserve someone who can match your ambitions." As they approached the airport, Sarah noticed Marcus checking his phone more frequently, his thumbs flying over the keyboard. "Important business?" she asked, trying to keep her tone light. "Just making sure everything's arranged perfectly for our arrival," he replied. But there was something in his voice that made Sarah's skin prickle. Before she could dwell on it, the car was pulling up to a private terminal where a sleek white jet sat waiting on the tarmac. "Here we are," Marcus announced, helping her out of the car. "Your chariot awaits, my dear." As they walked toward the jet, Sarah's designer heels clicking on the pavement, she couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. The way Marcus kept checking his phone, the slight tension in his shoulders, the fact that he'd planned all this so meticulously. "Ladies first," he said, gesturing to the jet's stairs with an elaborate bow. Sarah gathered her dress and began to climb, her heart racing with each step. This was really happening. She was really leaving everything behind for a man she barely knew, beyond stolen moments and promises of a better life. As she reached the top of the stairs, she paused for a moment, one hand on the doorframe. The interior of the jet was dark, and for a split second, she had the strangest urge to turn around and run. But Marcus was right behind her, his hand on the small of her back, gently urging her forward. Sarah stepped into the cabin, her eyes struggling to adjust to the dim light. And then she heard it, a sound that made her blood run cold. A familiar voice coming from the shadows at the back of the jet. "Hello, Sarah." Sarah froze, her white dress suddenly feeling too tight, too confining. The cabin lights slowly brightened, revealing David sitting in one of the plush leather seats, his bow tie undone, a glass of scotch in his hand. He looked exactly as she had imagined him earlier, except for his eyes. Those kind brown eyes that had always looked at her with such adoration now held something else entirely. I don't understand," she stammered, turning to look at Marcus. But Marcus had already stepped back, putting distance between them. His trademark confident smile had been replaced by something colder, more calculating. "Take a seat, Sarah," David said quietly. "We have a lot to discuss." Her legs trembling, Sarah sank into the nearest seat. The pristine white fabric of her dress spilled around her like foam on a treacherous sea. Through the cabin windows, she could see the chauffeur driving away, leaving her alone with the two men she had just betrayed in very different ways. "Would you like to explain what's going on?" she managed to ask, her voice barely above a whisper. "I think you're the one who owes us an explanation," Marcus replied, his tone no longer carrying that seductive warmth she'd grown so accustomed to. He moved to stand beside David's chair, and something in their body language made Sarah's stomach lurch. They weren't adversaries. They were allies. David took another sip of his scotch before speaking. "Did you really think I didn't notice, Sarah? The long lunches, the secret text messages, the way you started dressing differently when you knew Marcus would be in the office." "I wanted to tell you," Sarah began, but David held up his hand. "No, you didn't. You wanted to have your cake and eat it too. Keep me as the safe backup plan while you tested the waters with Marcus." He leaned forward, his elbows on his knees. "What I want to know is, when exactly did you start planning to leave me at the altar? Or was that Marcus's idea?" Sarah's eyes darted to Marcus, who was now casually examining his phone, as if this conversation bored him. "Marcus?" she said weakly. "Oh, right." Marcus looked up, that familiar smirk playing on his lips. "I suppose I should mention that there is no villa in Santorini, no 300 million in funding either, though I must say, you were remarkably easy to convince. I barely had to try." The world seemed to tilt on its axis as Sarah's mind raced to process what was happening. "This was a setup," she whispered. "Let's call it a test," David replied. "One you failed spectacularly, by the way. Though I suppose I should thank you for making it so definitive. No room for doubt or second chances." But all those conversations we had," Sarah turned to Marcus, desperation creeping into her voice. "The messages, the moments we shared." Marcus actually laughed. "You mean the carefully scripted interactions designed to see how far you'd go? Those were about as real as your commitment to David. Though I have to admit, you were very convincing when you talked about how bored you were with him, how you needed someone more ambitious." Sarah felt the blood drain from her face as David's expression hardened. Those conversations had been private, or so she'd thought. How many of their intimate exchanges had been shared, analyzed, used as evidence against her? "Why?" she managed to ask. "Why go through all this?" "Because I needed to know," David said simply. "Before we merged our lives completely, before we signed the prenup, before I made you a partial owner of the company, I needed to know if you were really in it for better or worse, or just waiting for a better offer." "The prenup?" Sarah repeated numbly, suddenly understanding. "This was about protecting the company." "Among other things," Marcus added. "Though I have to say, watching you throw away a genuine relationship for the promise of a more luxurious lifestyle was quite educational. Really puts things in perspective, doesn't it, David?" David nodded slowly, his eyes never leaving Sarah's face. "It certainly does. You know what the saddest part is? I actually hoped I was wrong. Right up until you walked into that gazebo, I was praying you'd prove me wrong." Sarah felt tears beginning to well up in her eyes, but whether they were from shame, anger, or the crushing realization of what she'd lost, she couldn't tell. "What happens now?" she asked, her voice cracking. "Now?" David stood up, straightening his jacket. "Now, you get to explain to 200 of our closest friends and family why there won't be a wedding today. Though I suppose Marcus's letter might help with that. Would you like to read it?" He held out his hand, and Marcus passed him the envelope Sarah had been clutching earlier. David opened it and pulled out a single sheet of paper. "Dear David," he read aloud, "I'm sorry, but I've decided to leave with Marcus. He can offer me the life I've always wanted. Please don't try to contact me." Short and sweet, isn't it? Were you planning to sign it, or just let your absence speak for itself? Sarah sat in stunned silence, the full weight of her actions crashing down around her. Every sweet message, every stolen glance, every moment she'd thought was building towards something real. It had all been orchestrated to expose her disloyalty, and she had played her part perfectly. The jet's door opened and a flight attendant appeared. "Mr. Chen, Mr. Reynolds, we're ready for takeoff whenever you are." "Thank you, Claire," David replied, then turned back to Sarah. "I believe your ride is waiting outside, unless you prefer to walk back to the resort in your wedding dress." Sarah looked out the window to see another black car had pulled up beside the jet. This was really happening. Not the romantic escape she'd imagined, but a walk of shame back to face the consequences of her choices. As she stood on shaky legs, gathering her dress around her, Marcus spoke up one last time. "Oh, and Sarah, that investment deal I mentioned, it is real. Just closed this morning. 9 figures just like I said. The only difference is," he smiled, showing teeth, "you won't be seeing a penny of it." David held out his hand, and Sarah automatically reached for it before realizing he was gesturing for her to return her engagement ring. His grandmother's ring. She slipped it off her finger, noting how light it felt now, how insignificant compared to the weight of what she'd done. As she made her way down the jet's stairs, her designer dress now wrinkled and stained with grass from her earlier rendezvous at the gazebo, Sarah could feel their eyes on her back. She wondered if they would laugh once she was gone, share a celebratory drink over their successful sting operation, or maybe they would just sit in silence, processing the wreckage of what trust and betrayal could do to relationships built over years. The new chauffeur held the car door open for her, without meeting her eyes. As she sank into the back seat, Sarah caught one last glimpse of David and Marcus through the jet's window. They were talking, heads close together, probably already moving on to discuss business matters, the billion-dollar company they would now run without her. The car pulled away from the jet, carrying her back toward the resort where 200 guests were about to learn just how thoroughly she had sabotaged her own happiness. Sarah leaned her forehead against the cool window, closing her eyes against the tears that threatened to fall. What she didn't know was that her humiliation was far from over. What awaited her at the resort would make her current shame feel like a mere prelude. But for now, she sat in silence, replaying every moment that had led her to this point, wondering how she could have been so blind, so easily manipulated, so willing to throw away something real for the mere promise of something more. The car wound its way back through the countryside, each turn taking her closer to the reckoning that awaited. In her mind, Sarah could already hear the whispers, see the judgment in every face. But, beneath the anxiety and shame, another emotion was beginning to surface, one that would soon prove just as dangerous as the greed that had led her to this moment. As the car approached the Crystal Lake Resort, Sarah noticed something odd. Instead of heading to the main entrance, the driver took a service road that led to the back of the property. Through her tears, she saw a small crowd gathered near the kitchen entrance. Hotel staff, wedding vendors, and, was that a camera crew? Her heart stopped when she saw the Channel 7 news van, partially hidden behind the catering trucks. This couldn't be happening. The car came to a stop, and before Sarah could protest, her door was opened by a woman in a crisp business suit. "Ms. Chen, I'm Regina Walsh, David's PR manager. If you'll follow me, we have a statement prepared for you to read." "A statement?" Sarah's voice cracked. "I'm not reading any statement. I just want to go home." Regina's professional smile didn't waver. "I'm afraid that's not an option right now. You see, David and Marcus's merger announcement is going live in exactly 40 minutes. Your situation is part of the press narrative." "Press narrative?" Sarah felt like a parrot, unable to do more than echo Regina's words as her world continued to crumble around her. "Yes, a cautionary tale about loyalty, trust, and corporate ethics. David and Marcus's triumph over personal betrayal to build something greater. It's quite compelling, actually." Regina checked her tablet. "The story's already trending on social media. Yari Wedding Fail and Gold Digger Got Played are particularly popular." Sarah's knees buckled, and she had to lean against the car to stay upright. They weren't just content with humiliating her in front of the wedding guests. They were going to make her public spectacle. "This is insane," she whispered. "They can't do this." "Actually, they can. You signed a rather comprehensive personal conduct clause when you joined the company. Section 7.3 specifically covers public statements regarding relationships between employees and management." Regina's smile turned sympathetic. "Though I doubt you read that part carefully, given how eager you were to get your hands on those stock options." The sound of approaching helicopters made Sarah look up. News choppers, of course. This was Silicon Valley's scandal of the week, and she was the star. "Now," Regina continued, handing her a tablet, "this statement acknowledges your attempted infidelity, expresses remorse for your actions, and supports the merger announcement. Read it word for word, and will ensure your severance package remains intact. Deviate from the script? She shrugged elegantly. Well, let's just say David and Marcus have quite a few recordings of your private conversations that the public might find interesting. Sarah scanned the statement, her humiliation growing with each perfectly crafted sentence of self-condemnation. They had thought of everything, planned for every contingency. While she had been dreaming of luxury villas and private jets, they had been building an elaborate trap, complete with legal safeguards and media strategy. The guests, she asked weakly, are being informed of the situation as we speak. Your maid of honor is handling the gift returns, and the resort has been quite understanding about the last-minute cancellation. Something about David tripling their standard fee for the inconvenience. Sarah looked down at her now ruined wedding dress, at the grass stains that marked her failed escape attempt. In the harsh light of day, every choice she had made seemed impossibly foolish. She had gambled everything, her relationship, her career, her reputation, on Marcus's empty promises, and now she was going to pay the price in the most public way possible. But as she stood there, something shifted inside her. The shame and regret began to crystallize into something harder, sharper. They had manipulated her, recorded her, planned her downfall with meticulous precision. Yes, she had been disloyal, greedy, easily seduced by the promise of wealth. But this level of revenge, this calculated destruction of her entire life? Sarah straightened her spine, smoothed her dress, and wiped away her tears. Regina was watching her expectantly, tablet still extended. The camera crews were setting up their equipment, preparing to broadcast her humiliation to the world. You know what the interesting thing about cornered animals is, Regina? Sarah asked quietly. Regina's professional smile faltered slightly. I'm sorry? They've got nothing left to lose. Sarah's fingers tightened around the tablet as her mind raced through everything she knew about David and Marcus's company. All those late nights she'd spent helping David with paperwork, all those confidential conversations she'd overheard, all those files she'd had access to as David's fiancée and executive assistant. She thought about the offshore accounts she'd helped set up, the creative accounting she'd witnessed, the questionable patents that formed the backbone of their technology. She thought about the venture capitalists who might be very interested in knowing exactly how their investments were being managed. A small smile played at the corners of her mouth as she looked at Regina. I think I'd like to make a few edits to that statement. The PR manager's face paled slightly as she recognized the look in Sarah's eyes. It was the same look of calculated determination that David got when he was about to close a deal. The same look that had made him such a successful CEO. The same look he had taught Sarah during their years together. The helicopters circled overhead as Sarah stepped toward the waiting cameras, her ruined wedding dress trailing behind her like a battle flag. They wanted a show? She would give them one they'd never forget. What David and Marcus didn't know was that Sarah had learned more from them than just the taste for luxury. She had learned how to play the long game, how to turn circumstances to her advantage, how to wait for the perfect moment to strike. And as she stood before the cameras, tablet in hand, Sarah realized that this very public humiliation might just be the opportunity she had been waiting for. After all, hell hath no fury like a woman with inside knowledge of Silicon Valley's dirtiest secrets. The red lights on the cameras began to blink, and Sarah took a deep breath. The real game was about to begin. Good afternoon, Sarah began, her voice steady despite the chaos in her heart. The cameras focused on her face as she stood in her sullied wedding dress, a picture of betrayed innocence. I'd like to thank everyone for being here today. What was supposed to be my wedding has turned into something quite different, a lesson in corporate manipulation and psychological warfare. Regina stepped forward, reaching for the tablet, but Sarah smoothly sidestepped her. 6 years of yoga classes were finally paying off. Before I address the merger announcement between Chen Technologies and Reynolds Enterprises, I'd like to share some interesting documents that came into my possession during my time as both executive assistant and fiancé to David Chen. High above, she could hear the news helicopters drawing closer, their cameras undoubtedly zooming in on her face. In her peripheral vision, she saw Regina frantically typing on her phone. Security would be here soon, but they wouldn't make it in time. These documents, Sarah continued, her voice growing stronger, detail a fascinating pattern of patent infringement, creative accounting, and what some might call corporate espionage. But perhaps most interesting is the series of offshore accounts established in the Cayman Islands under the name Project Phoenix. She heard Regina's sharp intake of breath. Project Phoenix was supposed to be known only to the board of directors, but Sarah had been the one handling David's paperwork, scheduling his secret meetings, coordinating with the lawyers. She knew everything. "Ms. Chen," a reporter called out, "are you suggesting that the merger announcement today is covering up illegal activities?" Sarah smiled, the same practiced smile she'd learned from watching Marcus charm investors. "I'm not suggesting anything. I'm merely exercising my rights as a whistleblower under SEC regulations. The relevant documentation has already been sent to the appropriate authorities, as well as several reputable news organizations." She saw movement at the far end of the parking lot. David and Marcus had arrived. They were running toward her, their faces twisted with rage and fear. But it was too late. "I particularly think the venture capital firms might be interested in knowing how their Series C funding was actually spent, and the patent office might have some questions about the origin of certain key technologies." Sarah's voice carried clearly over the growing murmurs of the crowd. David reached her first, his face ashen. "Sarah, stop this right now," he hissed, grabbing her arm. She turned to face him, making sure the cameras caught his aggressive gesture. "Or what, David? You'll release the recordings of our private conversations? Go ahead. I'm sure the SEC would love to hear them too, especially the parts where you discussed your creative approach to quarterly reporting." Marcus stepped forward, his charming smile now desperate. "Think about what you're doing, Sarah. We can work something out. Like the way you worked out this elaborate scheme to humiliate me." She laughed, and the sound carried across the parking lot. "You taught me well, both of you, about power, about leverage, about waiting for the perfect moment to strike. Consider this my graduation project." Security finally arrived, moving to surround her, but the damage was done. The reporters were shouting questions, cameras were flashing, and in the distance she could hear police sirens approaching. Someone had evidently taken her allegations seriously. "One more thing," Sarah added, turning back to the cameras. "To any future investors considering working with Chen Technologies or Reynolds Enterprises, you might want to take a close look at their blockchain patents. I have it on good authority that they bear a striking resemblance to some interesting work being done by college students who interned here last summer." The security guards reached for her, but Sarah didn't resist. She had said what she needed to say. As they led her away, she caught a glimpse of David and Marcus huddled with their lawyers, their faces drawn with worry. The merger announcement forgotten, their phones buzzing constantly as the news spread through Silicon Valley's networks. Regina hurried after her, heels clicking on the pavement. "Do you have any idea what you've just done?" Sarah smiled serenely. "Created a compelling narrative about loyalty, trust, and corporate ethics." As she was escorted to a private room inside the resort, Sarah could hear the chaos erupting behind her. Reporters were shouting questions, photographers were snapping pictures, and somewhere in the distance, more police sirens were approaching. She had lost everything today, her fiancé, her job, her reputation, but she had gained something too, the understanding that sometimes the best revenge isn't about destruction, but about revelation, about bringing secrets into the light. The door closed behind her, but through the window she could see David and Marcus's world beginning to unravel. Their phones wouldn't stop ringing, reporters were swarming, and a black SUV with government plates had just pulled into the parking lot. Sarah sank into a chair, smoothing her ruined wedding dress. The day wasn't turning out how anyone had planned, least of all her. But as she watched the chaos unfold through the window, she realized that sometimes the best way to deal with a trap is to spring it so hard it breaks in the trapper's hands. Her phone buzzed, a message from an unknown number. "Impressive show, we should talk. KR." Sarah recognized those initials. Catherine Reynolds, Marcus's estranged sister, and the founder of a rival tech company, the same Catherine who had been trying to expose her brother's business practices for years. Perhaps this wasn't the end of her story after all. Perhaps it was just the beginning. In the parking lot, David and Marcus were now surrounded by men in dark suits showing federal badges. Their perfect plan had backfired spectacularly, and Sarah allowed herself a small smile as she watched their world crumble. Sometimes the best revenge isn't about getting even. It's about getting ahead. Sarah's phone buzzed again. Another message from Catherine Reynolds. Meet me at Crest and Crown, private room 7, 8 p.m. Come alone, delete this message. She glanced at the chaos still unfolding outside. David and Marcus were being escorted to separate vehicles, their faces ashen as federal agents flanked them. News crews scrambled to capture every moment, and in the distance she could see wedding guests leaving in a steady stream, their faces a mixture of shock and scandalized delight. A soft knock at the door interrupted her thoughts. Regina entered, her perfectly composed facade finally showing cracks. "The FBI wants to speak with you," she said quietly. "They're setting up in the resort's conference room." Sarah nodded, unsurprised. "I assume they'll want to see the documentation?" "Among other things." Regina hesitated, then sat down across from her. "You know, when they hired me to handle the PR for this merger, they told me you were just a gold digger who needed to be taught a lesson. I actually felt sorry for David. And now I'm wondering if they weren't the ones who needed the lesson." Regina's lips curved in a slight smile. "They never mentioned that you had a photographic memory, or that you'd been quietly documenting everything for the past 3 years." "People tend to underestimate executive assistants," Sarah replied, smoothing her dress. "We're like furniture to them, present but invisible. They forget we see everything, hear everything, know everything." Regina's phone chimed. She checked it and grimaced. "The company's stock is in free fall. The merger's dead. The board is calling for an emergency meeting." "They should be more worried about the SEC investigation," Sarah said calmly, "especially once they check those offshore accounts." "You really did have it all planned out, didn't you? Even before Marcus approached you?" As Sarah thought back to the first time she'd noticed the discrepancies in the company's patents, the late-night conversations she'd overheard, the gradual realization that David and Marcus's success was built on stolen ideas and manipulated numbers. "Let's just say I learned from the best," she replied. "David always said timing was everything in business. He was right." Regina stood, smoothing her skirt. "The FBI agents will be here soon. Whatever game you're playing, I hope you know what you're doing." "I'm not playing games anymore, Regina. That's what they never understood. They thought I was a pawn in their chess match, but they forgot that pawns can become queens." After Regina left, Sarah checked her phone again. 6:45 p.m., just over an hour until her meeting with Catherine Reynolds. She had heard rumors about Catherine, a brilliant programmer who'd left the family business after a bitter dispute with Marcus, only to build her own successful tech company focused on cybersecurity. Sarah opened her clutch, removing a small USB drive hidden in a compartment she'd sewn herself. On it was everything the FBI would need, plus a few extra pieces of information she was saving for Catherine. After all, the best deals always involved having something valuable to trade. She stood, walking to the window. The sun was setting over Silicon Valley, painting the sky in shades of pink and gold. Somewhere out there, David and Marcus were probably already calling their lawyers, trying to damage control their way out of this situation. But they'd taught her too well about the importance of documentation, about building airtight cases, about leaving no escape routes. A knock at the door signaled the arrival of the FBI agents. Sarah took a deep breath, touching the USB drive in her pocket like a talisman. The next few hours would determine everything, not just the fate of Chen Technologies and Reynolds Enterprises, but her own future in the cutthroat world of Silicon Valley. "Come in," she called out, turning to face the door. She was ready for the next phase of her plan. After all, revenge was just the beginning. The real prize was still to come. The door opened, revealing 2 agents in dark suits. Behind them, Sarah caught a glimpse of Catherine Reynolds in the hallway, having arrived hours ahead of schedule. Their eyes met briefly and Catherine gave her a slight nod. The game was changing. New players were entering the field, and Sarah Chen, the woman who was supposed to be nothing more than a cautionary tale about greed and betrayal, was about to rewrite the entire story. "Ms. Chen," the taller FBI agent began, "I'm Agent Brooks, and this is Agent Martinez. We'd like to discuss the allegations you've made regarding Chen Technologies and Reynolds Enterprises." "Of course," Sarah replied, gesturing to the chairs. "Though I believe Ms. Reynolds should join us, considering her company's pending lawsuit against her brother." Catherine stepped into the room, her presence commanding attention despite her petite frame. Unlike her brother Marcus's flashy style, she favored understated elegance, a simple black blazer over dark jeans, her silver-streaked hair pulled back in a neat ponytail. "The lawsuit is actually what brought their activities to our attention," Agent Martinez said, pulling out a laptop. Ms. Reynolds provided some interesting data about patent infringement, but nothing concrete enough for criminal charges. Until now. Sarah reached into her clutch and removed the USB drive. This should fill in the missing pieces. 6 years of documentation, including emails, meeting recordings, and financial transactions. Pay particular attention to the folder marked Project Phoenix. It's quite enlightening. Catherine's eyes narrowed at the mention of Project Phoenix. They actually documented it? David has a peculiar habit of keeping trophy files, Sarah explained. He calls them his victory roadmaps. Every scheme, every stolen idea, every manipulated number, all carefully cataloged to remind himself how clever he is. Agent Brooks connected the USB drive to their laptop, and their eyes widened as they scrolled through the files. This is extensive. It should be. I've been gathering it since the day I overheard them discussing how they'd stolen their core technology from a group of college interns. Sarah smoothed her wedding dress, now a battle-worn symbol of her transformation. The same day I realized who David really was. "Why didn't you come forward sooner?" Catherine asked, though her tone suggested she already knew the answer. "Because taking down a company requires more than evidence. It requires perfect timing." Sarah stood, walking to the window. The news vans were still outside, their satellite dishes reaching toward the darkening sky. "David and Marcus just handed me that timing on a silver platter. Their little revenge scheme gave me the perfect platform, and made sure everyone was watching." Agent Martinez looked up from the laptop. "This goes beyond patent infringement. We're seeing evidence of wire fraud, tax evasion, insider trading." "And that's just the beginning," Catherine interjected. "Wait until you see how they've been handling their international contracts." Sarah turned back to face them. "I assume you'll need me to testify?" "You'll be our key witness," Agent Brooks confirmed, "though, given the circumstances, we should discuss witness protection." A slight smile played at Sarah's lips. "That won't be necessary. David and Marcus aren't the type to resort to violence. Their weapon of choice is humiliation, which only works if the target cares about their reputation." "And you don't?" Catherine asked, studying her carefully. "Let's just say my priorities have changed." Sarah smoothed her dress again, a gesture that was becoming almost meditative. "They tried to destroy my reputation to protect their empire. I'm willing to sacrifice my reputation to destroy theirs." The door opened again, and Regina slipped in. "You need to see this," she said, holding up her tablet. On the screen, Chen Technologies' stock price was in free fall, dropping so fast it looked like a vertical line. "The market's reacting to the FBI presence," Catherine explained. "Once those SEC violations hit the news, the company will be unsalvageable," Sarah finished. "Which brings us to why you're really here, Ms. Reynolds." Catherine's eyebrow arched. "Oh? You're not just here to help the FBI. You're here because when Chen Technologies crashes, their core assets will be up for grabs, including those patents you've been fighting over." A slow smile spread across Catherine's face. "You've done your homework." "I learned from the best," Sarah replied. "Though unlike my former fiancé, I believe in fair deals. You want the patents. I want a seat on your board and control of the new cybersecurity division you're planning to launch." The FBI agents exchanged glances while Regina tried to hide her surprise. Catherine, however, looked impressed. "You're nothing like what Marcus described," she said finally. "No," Sarah agreed. "I'm what he and David created. They taught me everything about power, manipulation, and corporate warfare. They just never expected me to use those lessons against them." Her phone buzzed. A news alert. The story was breaking nationwide now. Video of her statement outside the resort was going viral, along with photos of David and Marcus being escorted to FBI vehicles. "Ms. Chen," Agent Brooks said, "we'll need you to come to our offices to make a formal statement." "Of course." Sarah gathered her things, then paused. "Just one more thing." She turned to Catherine. "Do we have a deal?" Catherine extended her hand. "Welcome to Reynolds Cybersecurity, Board Member Chen." As they shook hands, Sarah caught her reflection in the window. She was still wearing her wedding dress, but she no longer saw a bride who'd lost everything. Instead, she saw a woman who'd turned a trap into a triumph, who transformed betrayal into opportunity. The sun had fully set now, and Silicon Valley's lights twinkled below like a carpet of stars. Somewhere out there, David and Marcus were beginning to realize just how completely their plan had backfired. They'd tried to write her off as a cautionary tale about greed and disloyalty. Instead, they'd written themselves into a story about hubris and karma. And Sarah, she was just getting started. 6 months later, Sarah sat in her corner office at Reynolds Cybersecurity, watching the morning sun glint off the buildings of Silicon Valley. The Wall Street Journal lay open on her desk, its headline bold and unforgiving. Chen and Reynolds sentenced tech titans face 15 years for fraud. Her phone buzzed. A message from Catherine. Board meeting in 10. The acquisition is ready to move forward. Sarah smiled, smoothing her Armani suit as she stood. The outfit had cost more than her wedding dress, but unlike that ill-fated garment, this one represented who she truly was. She'd kept the wedding dress, though, professionally cleaned and preserved in a box at the back of her closet. A reminder of where she'd come from, and how far she'd come. The conference room was already full when she arrived. Catherine sat at the head of the table, flanked by their top executives and legal team. On the massive screen behind her, graphs showed the steady rise of Reynolds Cybersecurity's stock since Sarah had joined the board. "Morning, everyone," Sarah said, taking her seat. "Shall we discuss the Chen Technologies acquisition?" The irony wasn't lost on anyone. The company she'd helped expose was now being sold for parts, and she was helping decide its fate. The patents would go to Reynolds Cybersecurity, the client list to their subsidiaries, and the remaining assets would be liquidated to pay restitution to the investors David and Marcus had defrauded. "The prosecutors called this morning," Catherine announced. "They're offering Marcus a deal if he testifies against the board members who knew about Project Phoenix." "Let me guess," Sarah interjected. "He took it immediately." Catherine nodded. "Just like you predicted. My brother always was predictable in his self-preservation." The meeting proceeded smoothly, with Sarah offering insights into Chen Technologies' operations that only an insider could provide. She had transformed her years as David's fiancée and executive assistant into a roadmap for dismantling his empire and building something better from its ruins. After the meeting, Catherine held her back. "Have you seen this?" She handed Sarah her tablet, showing a news article. David had written a letter from prison, a lengthy missive about betrayal and revenge. "Still trying to paint himself as the victim," Sarah observed, scanning the text. "Though I notice he doesn't mention the stolen patents or the defrauded investors." "Men like David and my brother never see themselves as villains," Catherine said. "In their minds, they're still the heroes of the story." "And what are we?" Catherine smiled. "We're the ones who saw through their act. Speaking of which," she pulled up another document on her tablet. "The FBI found something interesting in Marcus's private server. Apparently, their plan to humiliate you at the wedding wasn't the original plan." Sarah's interest piqued. "Oh?" "They were going to wait until after the honeymoon, let you sign all the merger paperwork, get your fingerprints on their schemes, then expose you as a corporate spy. They had fake evidence prepared and everything. The wedding scheme was actually their backup plan." Sarah felt a chill run down her spine. If she hadn't gathered her evidence when she did, if she hadn't been prepared. "They never did understand the difference between manipulation and strategy," she said finally. "No," Catherine agreed. "They thought they were playing chess, moving pieces around a board, but you were playing Go, seeing the whole pattern, thinking 10 moves ahead." Sarah's phone buzzed again. Another news alert. One of the venture capital firms that had backed Chen Technologies was being investigated for their role in Project Phoenix. The dominoes were still falling, months after her wedding day revelation. "Any regrets?" Catherine asked. Sarah thought about it. She thought about the life she might have had with David, the wealth she might have shared with him, the power couple they might have become. Then she thought about the lies, the manipulations, the casual cruelty with which he and Marcus had planned to destroy her. "Just one," she said finally. "I wish I'd seen them for who they really were sooner. But then again," she gestured to her office, to the empire they were building. "Sometimes you have to go through hell to find your true path." Catherine nodded approvingly. "Speaking of paths, the cybersecurity division is exceeding all projections. The board is talking about making you CEO." "Of the division?" "Of the company." Catherine's eyes twinkled. I'm thinking of stepping back, focusing on R&D. We need someone with your strategic thinking at the helm." Sarah felt her breath catch. From almost bride to almost pariah to potential CEO, all in 6 months. Life had a way of taking unexpected turns. "Think about it," Catherine said, heading for the door. "Oh, and Sarah? David's appeal hearing is next week. The prosecutors want you to testify again." Sarah turned back to the window, looking out at the valley where she'd lost everything and found herself in the process. "Tell them I'll be there, after all." She smiled at her reflection, seeing not the naive bride she'd been, but the power player she'd become. It's important to finish what you start. As Catherine left, Sarah's phone buzzed one final time. A message from an unknown number. "You won? Happy now? D." She deleted it without responding. David still didn't understand. This wasn't about winning or losing. It wasn't even about revenge anymore. It was about justice, about truth, about building something real from the ashes of lies. And she was just getting started. 1 year to the day after her failed wedding, Sarah stood at the podium of Reynolds Cybersecurity's annual shareholders meeting. The audience was packed with investors, reporters, and industry leaders, all eager to hear from the woman who'd become Silicon Valley's most talked about CEO. "When we look at the technology industry," she began, her voice steady and confident, "we often focus on innovation, on disruption, on the next big thing. But today, I want to talk about something else: integrity." In the front row, Catherine Reynolds smiled approvingly. She'd officially handed over the CEO position to Sarah 3 months ago, in a transition that had made headlines across the tech world. The story was too perfect for the media to resist. The wronged bride who'd exposed corporate fraud, only to rise from the ashes as a more powerful force than her would-be destroyers. "A year ago, I learned a valuable lesson about the price of greed," Sarah continued. "I watched 2 brilliant men throw away their legacy because they believed rules didn't apply to them. They thought power meant freedom from accountability." She paused, letting her gaze sweep across the audience. "They were wrong, and today, I'm proud to announce that Reynolds Cybersecurity is launching the Tech Ethics Initiative, a $100 million program dedicated to protecting innovators and whistleblowers in our industry." The audience burst into applause. In the back of the room, Sarah spotted Regina, who jumped ship from Chen Technologies months ago to become Reynolds' new PR chief. She gave Sarah a subtle thumbs up. "The initiative will provide legal support, technical resources, and career protection for individuals who expose corporate wrongdoing. Because innovation without integrity isn't disruption, it's destruction." After the presentation, as the crowd mingled over cocktails, Catherine pulled Sarah aside. "Quite a way to mark the anniversary," she said, handing Sarah a glass of champagne. "Seemed appropriate," Sarah replied, "though I doubt David and Marcus will appreciate the symbolism." "They can contemplate it from their cells," Catherine smirked. "By the way, did you see the latest? The FBI just arrested 3 more venture capitalists connected to Project Phoenix. Apparently, your testimony opened quite a few doors for the investigation." Sarah nodded, remembering her final day in court. She'd stood before the judge in another white dress, this one a power suit that cost more than her entire wedding had been meant to. David and Marcus had refused to meet her eyes as she testified, but she'd felt their hatred radiating across the courtroom. "You know," Catherine mused, "when I first agreed to help you take them down, I thought you were just another player in Silicon Valley's revenge games. But you've turned out to be something else entirely." "Oh? You're a builder. Anyone can tear things down out of vengeance. But you took the ruins of their corruption and built something better." She gestured to the crowded room. "This isn't just about revenge anymore. It's about reform." Sarah smiled, thinking about how far she'd come from that moment in the garden gazebo, when she'd thought leaving with Marcus was her path to happiness. Sometimes you have to lose everything to find out what you're really worth. As the evening wound down, Sarah returned to her office to gather her things. On her desk sat a small package, a wedding gift that had arrived too late, finally delivered after being lost in the resort's mailroom for a year. The card read, "To David and Sarah, may your partnership be built on trust and integrity." Sarah laughed at the irony, then noticed a sticky note attached to the package in Regina's handwriting. "Found this while cleaning out the old PR files. Thought you might appreciate the symbolism. R." She opened the package to find a delicate glass sculpture of two hands clasped in partnership. Sarah placed it on her desk, next to her CEO placard and the Forbes magazine that had featured her on its cover last month. Her phone buzzed, a text from her mother. "Saw your speech online. So proud of you, honey. You've become so much more than that girl in the wedding dress." Sarah looked out at the twinkling lights of Silicon Valley, remembering the night she'd stood in a ruined wedding dress, watching her old life crumble. She'd thought it was the end of her story. Instead, it had been page one of a much better book. The Tech Ethics Initiative would ensure that the next whistleblower wouldn't have to lose everything to do the right thing. The next David or Marcus would think twice before stealing ideas or manipulating markets. And the next Sarah, well, maybe there wouldn't need to be a next Sarah. She gathered her things, ready to head home. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new opportunities, new chances to prove that success didn't have to come at the cost of integrity. As she reached the door, she paused, looking back at the glass sculpture on her desk. Partnership, trust, integrity. She'd lost the first two to learn the true value of the third. Sometimes, she reflected, the price of greed isn't paid by the greedy at all. Sometimes it's paid by those who learn to rise above it, who turn betrayal into breakthrough, devastation into determination. And sometimes, just sometimes, what looks like the worst day of your life turns out to be the first day of your best chapter. Sarah turned off the lights and closed the door, leaving behind the ghost of a bride and embracing the reality of who she'd become. Not a victim of revenge, but a champion of change. Not the woman who lost everything, but the woman who found her true worth in the aftermath. After all, the best revenge isn't just success. It's becoming someone better than those who tried to break you.